What's up, everybody? My name is Jeremy Schumacher. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I'm the Jer in Wellness with Jer. Thanks for checking out my channel today. Today, I'm going to do a review of a graphic novel I read recently that I really like, that I think has a lot of things to say about mental health. So we're going to dive in. Ducks, which is written by Kate Beaton. Subtitle is 2 Years in the Oil Sands. Kate Beaton has written a bunch of other stuff. I believe she's a New York Times bestseller previous to this book. But Ducks was on a lot of best of the year lists at the end of 2022, and I had not gotten around to reading it. So I finally tracked it down in my local library. Shout out to getting graphic novels from your local library. I very much support local comic shops, but libraries are great too. So yeah, I wanted to read Ducks, and it was brutal, I think, is how to read it. It was not like a fun read. I don't think it was I think it was a very easy read. I'll put some pictures up from the book. It's written in kind of a cartoon style. I really like the artwork. The story is very like real life. I don't know how to describe it. Mundane makes it sound like it's boring. It wasn't boring, but it just kind of draws you into like the everyday nature of a lot of things in the book. And I think that was one of the things that was so like disheartening and kind of hard to sit with, was like, yeah, like so much of this is relatable. And a big thing I think in the book is the mental health and some of the things going on that have changed in society, because the book was written in a time frame for me as a millennial that I can relate to. So the setting of this book was between like 2005 and 2009. So when I would have been in college. And so there's a lot of, I think, relating to it in that sense. And a lot of what I think for millennials and Gen Z and under, where a lot of the mental health crisis is, I'm not putting parentheses in mental health crisis, but a lot of mental health factors in people. Mental health was a crisis before COVID, and then when COVID hit, a lot of us became more aware of it. And I think this book, without like hitting you over the head with it or being preachy about it, gets into where a lot of these mental health crises were coming from. So the book starts with it's a memoir. So the author's telling her own autobiographical story here. A piece of it anyway. And so it starts with her getting out of college. She went to a liberal arts college in Canada and got a degree in doing art. She's a cartoonist. So doing pictures and making cartoons and going to school for art, and basically being like, oh no, I'm in a bunch of student debt and there are no jobs. And so that's a big thing, first of all, relating to that. So I was a psych major, so there are no jobs for having a bachelor's degree in psychology. That's the thing I've said for years, and it's not entirely true. Although to make like sustainable career, life-supporting money, you do probably need a graduate degree. But so this person who has a liberal arts degree is passionate about something like creating comics, creating artwork, and is good at it, has talent at it, and is unable to find a job. And so there's this, it starts with like home, like she's back home, she went to school, and like now what? Now there are no jobs. And so in the US, this was like a huge financial crash. This was the housing bubble that had been inflated through a bunch of like nonsense, bad business decisions, and financial people lying, and then no one was held accountable. Maybe I don't want to do a review on The Big Short. It's way too sad. Anyway, there was one of the once-in-a-lifetime financial crises that millennials have now lived through 3 of once-in-a-lifetime financial crises. So that was like fresh out of college for a lot of people in the mid to late 2000s. It was like, great, you went and got an education and you're part of the best educated generation in the world, and yet nothing you can do with that. So that's where the book starts, and like that is even kind of like a sad, gross feeling of like, right, like we don't get to pick careers or go to school based on what we're good at. We're picking careers and jobs based on what will make someone else money. Yuck. So that's unhealthy, and that's the first like exploited topic of like exploitation that happens here is so our author then decides to go to the oil fields in Canada. So companies drilling for oil and extracting that oil and going out west where there'd be money to make, it'd be quick to make money, work for a couple years in like a not fun job, get out of student debt. And like, again, it's like, that doesn't speak well for society. My favorite author is Stephen Erickson, who wrote Malazan Book of the Fallen, and he writes, society should be judged on how they treat the least of the members of that society. And so I think, having a student who's well educated and like comes from a family that's been supportive and recommended education, and then like having to go work an unsafe job, unsafe both like physically and mentally. So I think that's like ick, gross. And I think that's one of the things that as a society we haven't really contended with yet, that like it's great for people to go get an education. It's great for people to be able to be told like you can do whatever you want, but like that's not true. That was toxic positivity. You can do whatever you want. Like, no, if you're 5'5", you're not going to go play in the NBA. So let's stop telling people that. Don't drop into the comments to talk about Muggsy Bogues and Spud Webb. There are two exceptions. Neither of them were 5'5". But so like building this idea of like, right, like do you get to have a career path, a job that you enjoy? And I think like some of that was unrealistic, but I also think like too much is made of like making money and like going into the oil fields where it's like destroying the environment. And that's like a subplot in the book. So like it's called Ducks, but like the oil field, these oil fields became famous for like killing hundreds of ducks at a time. Like ducks flew in the wrong part and like landed in these toxic, basically ponds, and it was horrific. And that made like all sorts of national news attention and stuff, but like it wasn't, people knew that, right? We've known about global warming since the 70s. Like there's corporate documents and memos from the 70s saying like, yeah, this is destroying the environment, and we haven't done anything about it. And I think that's another thing that is contributing to mental health problems for entire generations. Like 1980s, my brother is older than I am, but my brother grew up on Captain Planet. I'm at least familiar with Captain Planet. Like we knew the environment was being harmed at that point. I grew up, like, who remembers Fern Gully? Like, why were we watching these traumatizing things as children? But, like, that's the thing. It is traumatizing. Like, it's traumatizing the environment. And some of these things aren't going to be fixable. So some things like, oh, we're putting holes in the ozone layer, so we put in a bunch of rules and changed the way that aerosol cans work. And, like, that got fixed. Great. Nature healed itself. Tremendous. But like some of these things are doing have done lasting harm, and we've known about it, and we've not done anything so that like a handful of people can get rich, and that's gross. That's gross. So anyway, in our book here, our author goes out to the oil fields, and she's one of the few females who's working in this place. She's kind of somebody who like finds tools in an inventory and gives them out to people, and like the book. I think does a nice job of like just telling the story without bashing anyone, and the authors afterward I think really hits home this message too, that like there can be good and bad at the same time. So like the misogyny in the book, the low-key like sexism that this author had to deal with on a daily basis working in an environment where she's one of the few females, is again like terrible. It's just like daily sexual harassment. And I think a lot of people who might read the book might be like, well, that's nothing. And that's what the author gets told over and over again. She makes complaints, not like a ton of them, but like she goes to speak to her higher ups. At one point, she refuses to go work in a certain job site because of the amount of harassment she receives there. And like the boss in this scenario is just like, well, you knew what you were getting into coming to a man's job. And like, that person should have lost their job over that. Like, you don't get to tell someone that, and like you don't get to have workers who aren't protected like that. And so the misogyny that was present there, and like since then, this was set in 2007, 2008, 2009 type time frame. And so like the Me Too movement has happened since then, and we've held like a couple of figures responsible, right? Like Harvey Weinstein is in jail. Kevin Spacey doesn't get work anymore, like a couple of predators. But like these are things that have been going on for decades that we've known about. Like people who are serial sexual harassers or have even sexually assaulted people are still in positions of power. It's still getting elected somehow. And so there's still like a cultural thing where we don't listen to women who have been harassed or assaulted. We still don't prioritize people's safety the same way. Um, there's a couple instances in the book as it unfolds of sexual assault. And again, like that idea of victim blaming, like were you drunk or what? Some of the people responding to like putting yourself in a bad situation. Like it doesn't matter what situation you're in. It doesn't matter if you're in vibing in substance use or not. Like someone else doesn't have a right to harm you. Like that's not okay. And so I think the book does like a good job of kind of processing like that internal thing. As the sexual assaults, when the sexual assaults happen, the book also, without like hammering it or getting super psych jargony, talks about like dissociation and does a nice job of like through the medium of the graphic novel, like depicting where this person's brain goes as they're dissociating. It goes back home, it goes to the shore and the waves coming in. And like I think that's realistic, but also like being somebody who works with people who have trauma and working with people who have dissociated and are still dealing with things like that, like I can undersell some of the horror of it. Like having an out-of-body experience is not a safe thing. It's not a fun thing. It's not an okay thing. Like that is the brain in survival mode. Our brain does that so that we like don't go crazy. But the fallout from those traumatic events is then what could potentially make us feel crazy. Like as the author then opens up to different people over the book about the sexual assaults that she was a victim of, like every female she tells responds with a story of their own. And I think that's one of the things in the book that hit really hard was like, oh, like this is a common thing that like people are just sitting on because they're either blaming themselves or society has blamed them. The author and one of the people they tell like is looking for like ramifications or some sort of consequence, and like people respond with like, no one put a gun to your head, and like that's not the point. First of all, that's not the point. That's not an okay response. It's not an okay response to accept, to think somebody should accept harm because they're not being threatened with more harm. That doesn't make any sense. But the author writes about how it wasn't so much that they thought the person who was assaulting them was going to physically harm them more. Like they said, no, I don't want this. Please stop. And the person went through with it anyway. And that's sexual assault. That's rape. And so, but the thing that the author was worried about most wasn't what that person was going to do, but how the other workers would respond once she became labeled as somebody who makes complaints or files complaints or goes to HR. And again, like that's how on a societal level abuse is allowed to persist, and that's how often people are not supporting victims in the way that they need support. It can certainly be a messy business, and I, along with most of you, are not police officers who have to investigate these things. It's not about being like judge, jury, and executioner. It's about providing people who need support. And so victim blaming or getting into like, what did you do, or how did you speak up enough? Did you stop enough? Did you like, no, like sex needs to be consensual, full stop. Sex needs to be consensual. Any sexual activity needs to be consensual. And so when it's not, like that's sexual assault. Calling someone doll over and over again when they don't like it, like that's not a fun pet name. That's sexual harassment because you're using that nickname based on a gender profile, not because it's meaningful. And so I think the book kind of hits that note without like me getting on a soapbox. The book does a nice job of like talking about all of that through like an experiential way of like, some of these people were also kind of icky, but like also were supportive or helpful or nice to me in different ways. And so it's not like, oh, these were all like terrible, gross human beings. These are people who are bad. And like, this is a bad person because they're a rapist. Like, no, this is a person who like was in an unhelpful situation and did a bad thing by harassing someone or sexually assaulting someone, but like they wouldn't even have looked at it like that because they might have thought it was consensual, or they might have not been like understanding, they might not have known what consent even looked like. And so I think a lot of the book goes back to like a time and place for those of us who are millennials and older, like remembering like, right, sex ed used to not be a thing, and like people trying to keep sexual education out of education are like setting kids up to be harmed. These are things that we know through research are beneficial and provide safety and help for people. And so education is really great and powerful around these topics around consent and how to have healthy relationships, what communication between partners looks like. So again, like the book, I think just like so kind of matter of factly lays it all out that it's like almost horrific in a sense of like, man, this is uncomfortable to read because like it just happens. It happens to women all the time. It happens to any minority. It happens to people whenever there's power imbalance, right? If you're a dude and you're working for a high-powered CEO female and she slaps your butt every morning when she gets your coffee, like that's sexual harassment. Doesn't matter what gender you are, doesn't matter what it is. It's about a power imbalance. It's about somebody doing something that's non-consensual. So I think the book like deals with that topic in a very realistic and kind of raw sort of way without ever getting like graphic or explicit. It still like hits like the horrors of it, and how a traumatic event is just the start of trauma. Like trauma is how your brain responds to something after the fact. So the author talks to other females who then works at different camps, and some of the camp situations in the oil fields are much better than the other ones. There's stories of like dudes hiding in the girls' closets and watching them when they come in, and people like walking in all the time and being like, oops, wrong room, my bad, but like trying to walk in on a girl while she's changing or whatever. And so like there's that like yuckiness of it all, and just like the idea that for a long time society was just okay with these things, like just whatever, like boys will be boys. No, like that's sexual assault. There's no justification for that. That's harassment. There's no justification for that. So I want to get into a whole separate soapbox about cancel culture, but like there is no cancel culture. Like what we're experiencing now is people trying to hold people responsible for their actions, and that's not canceling them. Those are called consequences. I'll do a separate Aaron Rodgers video on people crying wolf when it comes to cancel culture and privileged people being upset about being held, about having consequences. Shoot, now I have to do that video because I have been planning on it and putting it off for a long time. Dux also talks about briefly, again, like without hitting you over the head with it, it does a really nice job of like getting into like the environmental fallout, like how many people worked in these camps have lung issues or developed cancer, how many people died just driving to and from work because the roads weren't, the highway to get to and from these places weren't well lit or weren't safe to traverse on. And again, like how people are just like, yep, another person died, and like so that everyone can have gas, but like also so that some CEO somewhere can make like an ungodly amount of money that they will never spend. And like we're just cool with like a certain level of human misery attached to capitalism. And so like I think as part of it is education, part of it is that the internet like expands our global view on things. We're knowing about some of the abuses that happen, like not buying from Nike because they still use sweatshops, and Apple also, and like we can get diamonds that don't involve slavery, and that's great. And there are still people who are like, nah, the slavery is kind of the point. I'm going to spend more on that because some kid had to die for this. Like, yuck, gross, don't do that. Human life should have more meaning than like what one handful of people have in their bank account. Gross. And as we become aware of this as a society and people grow up with this knowledge, like it becomes really disheartening and really discouraging, and it becomes bad for us mentally, where we're living in an environment with society and late stage capitalism that a lot of people wouldn't agree with. Like, we don't see much value in the way that money is spent. We don't see much value in the way that a handful of people get to spend money, the way that corporations can buy political ads and buy politicians and lobbying and all the like gross stuff that's like just blatant corruption. And I'm in a field that, like, right, where we have ethical practices and we have accountability built into being licensed professionals, and like, so we're trained as therapists to be wary of dual relationships. Like, we don't do therapy with our friends, we don't do therapy with our family members, we don't do therapy with our kids' teacher. Like, we don't want to have a space where we have a relationship with this person outside of therapy. Like, our clients need to have us be kind of like just in that therapy space and not elsewhere, or there's the potential for abuse. There's the potential for that imbalanced power, therapist versus client, to turn into an unhelpful situation. And so, like, for me, somebody who grows up and was taught and spent a lot of time in ethics classes and has these no dual relationships, to then see like, oh, well, there's money involved in politics, so they can have all the dual relationships they want. Like, nah, like, that's just corruption. And so the book doesn't, like, again, get super heavy handed with any of that, but like, it's this overarching dark cloud of like, right, this person went through daily sexism, misogyny. This person went through multiple issues of harassment or downright assault, outright assault. And like, for what? To pay off their college loans, to do a job that they're not interested in doing, that was bad for the environment and bad for them. And like, why are we doing that? And I think I hear questions like that a lot more in therapy now. Like, I'm supposed to like go to college and get a bunch of debt and then work a job that I don't really like, 40 hours a week, spend a third of my life working for like what? To do what? To make someone else money? Like, I don't want to do that. And so I think like that's a good healthy push towards like healthier work-life balance, where like places, not a ton in America, but other places at least, are starting to play with like 4-day work weeks. More and more people are like doing things like entrepreneurial and getting self-employed. If somebody would have told me starting out as a therapist that like I could make more by opening my own practice and work less hours, I would have done that. But like, I didn't get any training in business, and I thought it was like this unattainable thing. So I worked in these terrible settings where people had like super unhealthy contracts for me, and I was an independent contractor even though I should have been an employee, and I worked for unethical people who were kind of gross too. And like, again, a lot of that's just from lack of education, and it's from not knowing like what those things look like. So I think like talking about these things and things like talking about what you get paid, that came up late in the book. I almost forgot. It wasn't even really on my radar as a topic to talk about, but like, she realizes that somebody gets paid a lot more than her, and she's been there for 2 years, and this person's just starting out and is terrible at their job but doesn't know anything. And then yeah, so like, we're normalizing things like talk to your coworkers about what they get paid. Like, there should be equity in some of these things. And again, a lot of that on a societal level has to do with like a happier, healthier civilization, like people who are working, not just working, living to work, but like work provides for them in a way that they can live, like not having to work multiple jobs, not having to go into debt and then spend years fighting to come out of it, and all those things. So the book was like really good, but it was hard to read, and it was something that kind of sticks with you for a while. And because some of it's unresolved, right? So like late stage capitalism, we're still seeing the fallout of that on a regular basis. I work with people regularly who are dealing with power imbalances and abuse. I work with people who are dealing with trauma from sexual harassment or sexual assault. I work with people who are dealing with harassment and assault in other ways from power imbalances that I work with. And so, yeah, a lot of it was hard to read because it's not resolved. We haven't done a lot to address some of these things. I think there's been improvement in a lot of ways, but it's not to a point where like just anyone can go work somewhere where it's meaningful and that will pay all their bills and they're safe there. And so I think like that's the big thing for me that was really hard to sit with was like, right, like people for the sole purpose of money will go and work in unsafe environments just to like get out of the hole, and that seems so exploitative. Like it's just exploitation of people who are in need, and I think that's really gross, and I think we as a society need to be doing better than that, and I think people who are dealing with that need to speak up about it, and I think we need to be supporting people who are speaking up about it. The afterword in the book I thought was really interesting, because it talks about how like everyone's experience there was different. This is just her experience, but that she thinks like her experience was real, and a lot of people could relate to certain aspects, if not all of it, at least certain aspects of her experience. And like, you know, that there are things that like people who were also in unsafe environments, like there were multiple accidents, people being hurt on accidents, and the company lying about it so they could tout how many days it had been without an injury, and not supporting people, and people who have to spend X amount of time away from their family or move their family to an unsafe town so that they can make enough money to like survive. And so like exploitation across the board. Obviously like the sexism and the misogyny came through pretty strongly because it's a female author writing about working in an environment where she wasn't kept safe by her superiors. She wasn't provided safety by her superiors, and I think culturally, for a long time, women, really any minority but women in this case, not being protected in a way that would keep them safe. And so I think it was hard to sit with. I think she did a nice job of like, again, not being like this evil corporation did X, Y, and Z. Like I think as a reader, that's what we're left to conclude on our own. But that like she kind of writes from a way where like it's messy. Like it's not easy to say like my time there was all bad and awful and terrible, but that like terrible things happened. There were good people who were helpful and supportive, and there were people who helped keep me sane, and there were people who have been great in the intervening time. But like a lot of grossness, a lot of things that are a lot grosser when we kind of peel back the curtain and ask like, why did it need to happen this way, and realize like it didn't. Someone just made a lot of money off of this. So Ducks, I think it's a fantastic read. I absolutely think people should read it. I think it's a fantastic story. I think for as much as it's set in a certain time and a place, I think there's a lot of relatability to people. Even, you know, it came out last year, but it's written from 15 years ago and still relevant for today. So I think it's one of those things. I think it's a graphic novel that will be around for a long time, and people will talk about it for a lot of years because I think it's so relatable and covers so many topics in a way that like keeps you invested in reading it. So yeah, I strongly recommend it. I think it's kind of hard to sit with, but I think it does a nice job of talking about some hard topics. And I read it in less than a day, so you can kind of work through it pretty quickly. I read it in less than a day, and I got 2 kids under 5, so I don't have a ton of time for reading. So yeah, you can pick it up and put it down and pick it back up, and it's not like super taxing or intensive, even though it's covering some heavy topics. So 2 thumbs up. Go read it. It's a great book. All right, everybody, thanks for checking out my channel. Like, subscribe, comment, do those YouTube-y things. I don't know. YouTube is not my profession. It's just an outlet. So, hey, glad you're here. Check out Ducks. Peace.